So we just talked about our stance, our arm length, our setting ourselves up in the pre-lift ritual, getting our back tight, getting our core braced, and I started to talk about kind of leveraging like a swing against it with all your muscles being tight and pulling, just leaning back against the bar and how it naturally kind of comes off on its own. The next thing I want to talk about is the difference between wedging and hinging, because they're both very different. They're different but the same. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but over time, as you familiarize yourself with the lift and other lifters and see how they approach their lifts, you'll start to see some of what are the things I'll talk about. So we're setting up for the deadlift. One approach for your sumo deadlift is to wedge your hips in, because in most practices, or at least in theory, you would want your hips as close to the bar as possible. Of course, there's exceptions to that. People who deadlift sumo with a very narrow stance, hips very far back, more so like a conventional. But in general, what you're gonna think about is your hips being close to the bar. That way we can think about a vertical bar path, like just being up and down, rather than having to pull back into the bar. And the way that you accomplish your hips being in is by doing what people call wedging, which is kind of like you're here at the bar, and what you do is you kind of just pull your hips in. That way you're as upright as you can get. So for me, if I were to wedge, right, this is my stance, everything's set up. I grab the bar, I wedge my hips in. So instead of trying to leverage myself back, I drive my hips in and the bar comes off on its own. That's different from hinging, because what ultimately ends up happening when you wedge is your hips come under you. So your hips come under you like this, which forces your chest back into a more vertical position. When you're hinging, you're thinking more about engaging your hamstrings, glutes, etc., and leveraging the weight backwards rather than trying to get yourself under your own body to get vertical. So instead of thinking, okay, wedge to get myself up, and then from here it's kind of like a leg press in essence, right? You're starting to think more like a conventional deadlifter, where we're hinging from our hips so we can place load onto the posterior chain. And by hinging at our hips, we initiate by just leaning back against it. So that's the difference between hinging and wedging. They're both useful tools to think about and use in training and get really good at. There's lifters that are great at both. So there's no one size fits all, but practicing one or the other will definitely benefit you long term. And then switching it up to see if you respond better to hinging versus wedging.